Awesome. Hi, so I'm Kitty Dinshaw. I'm one of the co-founder and co-curator of Subject Matter Arts. We're an online platform. We represent I'm on the last calculation, 62% women artists. So obviously we're unusual in that sense. So gender equality has always been something that we're really interested in, something that we really want to change and make a difference. And obviously the way to start that is very much through what we do ourselves in our own actions. So welcome to this afternoon's talk on the challenges faced by women artists and how we can conquer them. I'm going to briefly lay out some of these challenges, but I don't really want to linger on that too much because I feel like it has been talked about a lot, and quite frankly I don't believe in just living with a negative, and I don't just believe in sort of just sitting with this. I don't want to talk about change. I want us to make change, and we can change the system, and I really want you to believe that we can. So I'm going to explore in more depth about ways that we can conquer these challenges. So first of all, one of the things that someone once said to me, which is absolutely right, is visibility is not equality. And yes, in the last probably 2 or 3 years, people have been talking about women artists. People have been saying it's an issue. Newspapers have been publishing articles suddenly discovering Villa de Barlow or whatever it might be. And actually, is that a lot of talk? And can we make it tangible change? Because I think you can talk, and while I think visibility in a sense at least is pushing the door open, you need to then actually take the actions and take the steps that are necessary to actually make that change that you're talking about. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going, because we're all UK based artists, I'm going to stick to the data from the Freelands Foundation. Partly because I think it's the most accurate, well-researched data out there. I think also particularly because it deals specifically with the UK, which is obviously where we're at. It's to give you its full title in case you want to then go and look it up, it's the annual report on the representation of female artists in Britain, and you can just get it from their website. The report that I'm working from is actually from June 2019. I'm sorry, they publish them every year, like literally next week. So if I was doing this in a couple of weeks, there would actually be a more up-to-date version. But my apologies for not being as up-to-date as I could be. If you're interested in the wider issue of gender equality, then obviously there's a lot of very well researched and very depressing reports from the Fawcett Society, and again they all sit on their website, so you can you can move to them. I'm also going to stick to talking about the primary art market only, largely because I feel the secondary art market is a whole other can of worms. You could go down a complete rabbit hole with it. And actually, I don't feel I want to talk to you about what's relevant to you in your careers, and I don't feel that's particularly relevant at the moment. So if you want to do some more research on that, the Freelands Foundation have all the relevant data, but I'm not going to really touch on that too much. So back to the tangible change, back to the actual figures and the actual facts, rather than just the Instagram memes and the sort of, socially conscious Instagram accounts and newspaper articles telling us all to buy women artists. So the main headline figure from 2018, which is when we have the most recent data, like I say, 2019 will be published hopefully next week, is that 64% of undergrad and 65% of postgrad students in creative arts and design courses in the UK are women. So this is interesting. So actually at this point, obviously we're doing very well. Then 51% of artists chosen for new contemporaries are women. So again, that's great. At the outset of an art career, gender parity is still there. It still exists. So then about 10 or 15 years on in your art career, only 32% of artists in the leading commercial galleries in London, so essentially the ones who show at Frieze and the ones that you could argue set the tone for much of the art market that then trickles down, are women. So there's actually this big drop of around probably 18 or 19% between the outset of leaving university, leaving your undergrad or your postgrad degree, possibly being shown at new contemporaries, So being in that leading vanguard of ones to watch, and then suddenly, there's a whole 10 or 15-year period. The drop off probably lies between art school graduation and mid-career. So probably a 10 or 15-year period where women artists suddenly start to become dramatically less successful than their male contemporaries. And that's the emerging artist period, essentially. So that's what I'm going to look at. I want to explore why there's this point when a woman is an emerging artist that she becomes, that not all women obviously, but a strong proportion of them become less successful than their male contemporaries. So I think there's been a lot of analysis on this. I'm not going to linger too long on it, just because I feel you've probably all heard a lot of it already. But just to set out a few basic points, and then we can expand on them later if you wish. So firstly, obviously, to recognise the scale of any problem, and this applies to women, it applies to other underrepresented groups, such as artists of colour or disabled artists, you need to look for an absence, which is really difficult. You need to actively ask yourself, where are the women? You need to reorient how you look at art. So you're not just admiring the work in an exhibition, but you're actually going on a little treasure hunt to find the women artists rather than just engaging with the work. And that's why I believe the issue was ignored for so long, and why it actually hasn't really been spoken about, for a very long time, for decades really, because no one saw it. It was one of these things that people just didn't notice, which is a terrible thing to say, but I think I personally believe that it's true. I think also what has influenced that and probably led to the fact that it wasn't noticed for so long, was the fact that I think people had perceptions around the artistic canon, and they had preconceptions around the artistic canon and around what good art is. And I think for so long our gaze was trained by male artists. I know when I was a kid in the early 1980s and mid 1980s, my mum would drag me off to the National Gallery, or she'd drag me off to Tate Britain, and probably now when I think about it, I would only look at male artists. I mean, I can't remember, but I also don't know of any really incredible women-led exhibitions in 1980s major institutions in London. And I think partly, obviously, in the case of something like the National Gallery, this is down to art history, which, is very hard to change because the work simply isn't there. But partly it's also down to those artists that we see in the major auctions, we see in institutions, we see in the top commercial galleries in London, we see at Frieze. And that therefore makes it very much also a contemporary issue. We can't just give up and say, oh, yeah, no, you see, we've all got these preconceptions about art, but it's all because of art history. It all happened in the 19th century. There's nothing we can do about it. No, our gaze is malleable. And contemporary art and the sort of contemporary art world needs to recognise what it needs to do to help to change those preconceptions and help to ensure that a generation like my kids' age, 8 and 5, growing up now, that they will grow up in a world where they do start to notice women artists and they do see them and they are visible to them, and that's really important. And actually, I have to say, I think certainly, maybe I have a particular bent, like when I take my kids to exhibitions, maybe I do look out for the female artist exhibitions, but I do think actually a lot of institutions in London are doing a really good job. I think Tate Modern does a good job now. I think, the Hayward Gallery, their Lee Bull exhibition I took my son to, oh my God, it was fantastic. We were there for about 3 hours. And I think that's something that has to change. We can make this a generational change, and we can make this a generational change for ourselves, but we also have to continue it through the younger generations and teenagers and early 20s and upwards. I genuinely believe that, because I believe that a lot of what my preconceptions around art were formed when I was young, because my mum was one of those mums that did take me to art galleries and unknowingly was exposing me probably primarily just to male work. And then, of course, the issue with that sort of situation is it becomes self-fulfilling, because male artists and their work are seen as important, they're seen as powerful, they're seen as unique and special, and they're talking a magical language, partly because they and they alone created that language. That's a language that we've always seen. And so it just becomes this sort of vicious circle that needs to be broken, and it needs to be broken now, and it needs to be broken quite firmly and quite strongly in order to make change. And then obviously this leads to my next point, which is a lack of market confidence. And this is an issue that, I know even some very passionate collectors of female artists will talk about, that, why aren't people buying women artists? Or if they are, why are their prices so low compared to the men? And I think it just comes back again to this language of power, and it's a wider structural issue in our society, that I think for a long time more collectors were male, so the galleries would wanted to appeal to those male collectors. These are galleries who will pay tens of thousands of pounds for a booth at Frieze. They'll pay a fortune in their rents in Mayfair or Soho. They also do need to pay their bills. And if they're looking to expand in Hong Kong or New York or wherever else, and there are all those additional costs. And I think for a long time, they have gone for that safe bet precisely because they need to be financially viable. And it's been possibly quite a lazy approach in a sense, because they've just gone, oh, well, I know that this man will sell. And they probably haven't even necessarily thought about it in the context of male or female necessarily. They've gone for what they feel is safe. And the issue with that then is, of course, the language of power that I've spoken about, that becomes ever more entrenched. So it's almost like we need a wholesale shift. It's not enough just for, say, certain galleries to show women some of the time. It's not enough for Frieze to have a social work section like they did a couple of years ago. It actually needs to be a wholesale, like almost like breaking down of what the art world has been, and what the structure of it has been, in order to kind of move forward and make change. And I know that probably sounds pretty radical, but I do feel that actually there really does need to be something that is really substantive, because at this current rate of change, it is happening, but it is very slow. It's not linear necessarily. It relies, then you end up in this situation where, again, you're relying on a few big name women to kind of carry the rest of the female artistic community along in terms of sort of visibility among society, and that in itself is wrong. So I think touching on, Susie, I think wanted me to touch on the pandemic and the situation as well. And I think the issue there is, post-pandemic, will galleries become even more reliant on that safe bet? They'll need to, restore their financial fortunes. And so will the progress that previous female artists have made, will that now be set back even further? That's, I think, a big question that we just don't know the answer to at the moment, and I think that's something that could certainly be an issue. One thing I'm going to just briefly touch on, I find this an incredibly poisonous concept, so if I start to turn green and get very upset, then that will be why. Is basically how poisonous the whole concept of art for investment is. It permeates now almost every aspect of the art world, every conversation. We sell art. The majority of our art is an average price of £500 to £1,000, so it's not super expensive. It's not some thousands of pounds worth of art, massive piece. And I still have so many clients and friends asking me, is it a good investment? And I think that's because people have been so attuned to that language of art for investment over the years, and it's just incredibly damaging. And I think it's yet another reason why women artists struggle, because again, it goes back to that sort of idea of the language of power, and the fact that male artists financially have always, their work has sold better. They're the ones that command the big prices at auction. They're the ones that, command the sold out shows at galleries. And so it's just another way for women artists to be at a disadvantage. And then finally, before I'm sorry, I feel like I'm giving us all the problems here. I'm just going to make one more point, because I think it's an important one, is the issue of labelling. And it's the stereotype and the expectations surrounding women's art. And I think women's art should just frankly be a term that's just art by women, or art by 50% of the population. Because I think I know I've definitely encountered conversations with collectors before who expect that women make work of a certain style. I think they expect introspection. They expect probably something to do with the body, possibly something to do with motherhood, something quite emotional. They can't. I think it's quite hard, and I don't quite know where this. I possibly think partly because Tracy Emin for a while was a very well-known woman artist, and that was the work that she made. But I feel like this has come from somewhere, and I don't know where. But this expectation and this stereotype is very, very present, and I personally really struggle with it because I see women making, incredibly diverse work every day. And of course, there is no parallel label or expectation for male artists, which is something that obviously is a problem. So, I mean, like, it's inconceivable to people, I think, that a woman could make like large scale industrial sculptures like, Davina Simo does, or, that's just Richard Serra, or, even until very recently, people didn't know of any female abstract expressionists. They'd never heard of Helen Frankenthaler or Lee Krasner. And that, again, is something that is problematic. It's an issue of education. It goes back to what people are being taught, but it also is an issue of what our mind and our eye wants to see, and what our minds and our eye notice, and what is being shown to us by the contemporary art society. And the bigger problem that this feeds into is that it further removes women from a mainstream artistic discourse. And again, it just promotes them as like a niche movement. It's like one type of art. It's like some kind of, some kind of niche movement, which is it's not acceptable. It's also just very, very boring. And it really, I think, sets back women's art, because if women then make unexpected art, suddenly the market doesn't get it, because they only expect a certain from women. So I'm not going to touch on motherhood, but just because I know there's going to be a later speaker in this series who is going to talk about motherhood. So I will leave that to her. And quite frankly, having now been at home with both my children for about 8 weeks, I think I probably would not, if I started talking about how motherhood essentially makes your life harder, I think I would never stop. So I will, I'll park that one. But just so you know, yes, I'm not ignoring that. That is a massive, massive factor and challenge. And let's have a think now. I want to talk about how we can conquer these challenges. And this is something that I'm always thinking about, and always thinking about ways actively to make that change that I've spoken about. I think for starters, I'm genuinely not sure how the pandemic and the lockdown will make a difference, because I think everything is so uncertain right now. All that we do know is that definitely it's harder for women. I feel this personally myself, but as for women artists, especially if you have children. And my big concern on a sort of larger scale is that with, compressed budgets, a need for money, galleries and institutions will pause the programs they've put in place to show female artists, and they'll concentrate more on those big blockbuster shows again, the ones that they can sell thousands of tickets for, the big names that they know will bring in the crowds that will then spend money in the gift shop or the cafe, those revenues that museums and modern museums also need. They're commercial entities now, as much as they are also given grants by the government and are not for profit at the same time. But let's look at what has already been achieved, because things have been achieved. There's big structural change needs to happen, yes, but there are things that are going on that are part of that structural change that I believe are making the change. And maybe, we laid enough seeds before the pandemic that they'll start to grow. Let's hope so. So before COVID-19, a major change was starting to occur, not as we saw in the commercial sector, but in the not-for-profit sector. So for the first time ever, and again, I'm going back to the Freelands Foundation here, 2018 saw many more solo exhibitions by women. They surveyed 40 non-commercial galleries in London and also outside London, 55% compared to 39% the previous year. And then outside London, the figure was at 50%. And then interestingly, also in this sector, 53% of museum and gallery directors were women. Now, the converse figure in the commercial sector is that there were, I think, 48% of gallery directors were women, but again, only that 32% representation. So the trickle down effect isn't happening in the commercial sector, but it is happening in the not-for-profit sector, which I find really interesting. I particularly find it interesting because these, of course, are the exhibitions that society as a whole goes to see. You know, the commercial galleries tend to be art enthusiasts and the odd person who's read about it in Time Out, and then like serious big time collectors. It's a fairly small number of people who see those exhibitions relative, obviously, to the population. Whereas actually, you know, museums and galleries across the country, in the not-for-profit sector, this is what art that society as a whole is going to see. This is what people are going to see. Well, obviously pre-lockdown, we're going to see on the weekends. This is what people were chatting about on Instagram or whatever. So actually, I think that is a hugely positive step. It's one that obviously needs to be maintained, and that's also really key, because this progress, as I've been looking back over, you know, previous reports and seeing the statistics, it's not linear. It's very slow, and it's not always linear. You can have a really great year just because there happen to be a couple of really major shows, and then it will go back down again. So it's really important to maintain this trajectory. And that's not something that, like, the museums and galleries obviously have to, but that's something that we can also really do ourselves to try to do that. So when they reopen, obviously, visit those exhibitions by women artists, you know, talk about them on Instagram, tag the museum, use the exhibition hashtag. Just even the price of your ticket alone shows the museum that those women artists are worth seeing. Even if you do nothing else, just buy a ticket, because that they're making money out of it, and they'll start to sit up and they will look and they'll see, oh, okay, so we sold X number of tickets for Dora Maar or whoever it is, and actually that's really significant, and that's a lot more than we expected. So, and okay, it may not be as much as Warhol, but it's a step. It shows that there is an audience out there for women artists beyond just the kind of what you'd expect, the niche collectors or the niche enthusiasts or whatever. And like I say, social media is obviously a very powerful tool in this, because they're all looking at their Instagram accounts and they're all seeing what is trending and, you know, what people are interested in and stuff. So I would definitely say that is a very simple way for all of us to be able to exert some pressure and start to, you know, hopefully push this change. And I know that, you know, this may seem contrived, it may seem a bit artificial, it may seem even a bit basic, but ultimately by supporting the Dora Maar exhibition, you're working to create a more level playing field for yourselves as women artists too. And we want you guys to be the generation that is actually recognised and has equality in the shows and is seen as often as the men are. And that can't happen in isolation. It has to happen in a sort of wider context. So, like I said at the start, you know, visibility isn't equality, but it is a wedge in the door. It's a starting point. It's that gap that we can move into. You know, we've spent so long looking for that absence. Now, actually, people are talking about that absence. People are admitting and recognizing that there is an absence. And that wasn't the case, say, 10 or 15 years ago. So that really can only be a good thing. Moving back to the coronavirus situation, something I was just preparing for the talk, and this just struck me, is actually how I feel like a lot of grassroots arts movements have become a lot more visible. I think because everyone is forced online, and I think like people are just looking at art more. I really feel that very strongly. I certainly noticed that with our own platform and our own accounts. And I think, you know, for example, something like the Artist Support Pledge, you know, people who wouldn't necessarily always buy art, but they've heard about it from a friend or whatever, even if they're not buying, they're just tuning in, they're interested, and women are very well represented there. You know, so many Instagram lives with female artists. It feels like actually this is a moment where even if the top-down approach is not working, even if that still is light years away, actually maybe we can change things ourselves just from the initiatives and everything that people are coming up with. And, you know, galleries and museums, they're charging headlong into the virtual world, and they have this massive content vacuum to fill, because obviously they can't have exhibitions at the moment, so they need artists to fill it. And there's a huge opportunity there also for female artists to be visible, because there's just so much need out there for artists to be talking, or to be making work, or to be being interviewed or showing videos, or whatever of their work, or whatever it might be. And then I will just briefly, sorry, I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to go on too much, but I'll just briefly mention Instagram and the internet. Obviously two quite big things, but a friend of mine once said, previously there were only textbooks, now we have the internet. And I think that's a really perfect analysis for the situation that we're in at the moment, the last 10 or 15 years, because now we have Thelma Golden interviewing Lorna Simpson. We have any number of podcasts or TED Talks where women curators, gallery directors, women artists speak. This is now the post Linda Nochlin generation, so we don't need to accept that there are no great women artists, because there are. And because of the internet, we're actually watching people speak to them, speak about them, we're reading articles about them, we're discovering them every day. I mean, if I had the time, which I do want to, but I don't have the time, sadly. But if I did have the time to really sit there and just pick a woman artist that I wanted to find out more about every single day, I could, just by the internet, and not on some wacky sites where you're not sure if what people are saying are true or not, but actually on mainstream sites, and that's amazing. And that's like a whole new generation of art scholarship presented in a different way to how it was before. And I think also, just briefly touching on Instagram, I think it's something where you can control your own destiny as emerging artists, obviously, and particularly as female artists. You can control how your work is seen. I find it, to my mind, a relatively gender neutral space, so you can find and create your own artistic communities. You can directly contact that curator you like. You can post your work exactly how you choose. You can interact with the people you want to interact with, and I think that's very powerful, because in a sense the gatekeepers are losing the keys, as it were. It doesn't necessarily need to be that your art now is mediated through a set number of people who you have to appease in order to get a good show, or whatever it might be. It is much more democratic. I'm not saying that system doesn't still exist, it does, but it's loosening around the edges, I think. And then finally, I just want to, I suppose, end with a couple of final thoughts. One is on creativity in lockdown. I think it's a really difficult proposition for most. I've definitely struggled. I think it's harder for those who are mothers, 100%, and I speak as a mother myself. And all I would say is, we're all struggling in different ways with different things, and just be kind to yourself. If you're able to make work, that's fantastic, but if you're not, don't worry. I think COVID-19, it will have such an enormous impact on the arts landscape that actually whether you make work or not in this time might not even be that relevant, because I just think that I don't know yet how things are going to go, but I think it will, everything will change a lot. I mean, I read something yesterday that says the South Bank Centre have already said they won't open until April 2021 because they actually can't afford to the losses if they opened with social distancing in place. So all I would say is, just be kind to yourself. I think there's a huge sort of quite capitalist narrative out there that Shakespeare wrote King Lear when he was in isolation, and you should learn a new language, or you should make art, or you should do this, or you should do that. You shouldn't do anything. This is a really weird situation, and I really think that in particular it can be quite difficult when you see lots of artists who are able to use this time and who are able to really make a lot of work. That might be great for them, and they might be able to. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be able to, and I think I just really want to say that from my heart, because I know that there are always pressures, and I don't want to I want you to feel like it's normal not to feel confident in that space right now. On just a final note on women and being a woman artist, I think my next piece of advice would just be ascribe your own value to your work. Don't just view value through the lens of price. It will be a long time before the market catches up to the wider art world. It will be a long time, I think, before women are valued as they should be valued with men, alongside men. So create your own value structure for your work, whatever it might be, whether it's like, I want to do a set number of residencies, or I want to show in these exhibitions, or, even just positive comments from your studio mates or from curators that or friends. I really believe that, price isn't everything. And I think it's especially dangerous for female artists to only feel as though they're succeeding if their work is selling well, because that's so much more difficult for women to achieve. And I just think that's a really, really hard sell on yourselves. It's not fair to yourself. So I really believe in like creating this, and I think it's actually true for all artists to a certain extent, is just creating your own value structure, realizing what is important to you, and understanding that price is often a very dangerous way to kind of judge yourself and hold yourself, value yourself against. And then finally, yes, the market, they do need to show confidence in women artists. They absolutely 100% do, and they're the ones that really need to catch up the most, I feel. They need to welcome the diversity of female artists' work. We need to get rid of the women artists tag forever. We need to continue this upward trajectory of women artists in non-profit spaces, so that younger collectors who are making maybe their first one or two purchases, they're used to seeing women artists in both big and small exhibitions, and they're therefore confident purchasing their work. And I think this again goes back to like what I was saying about how I value the institutions now where I can take my kids and they can see women artists and they can see solo shows by women, and for them it's perfectly normal to see a woman artist, just as it's perfectly normal to see a male artist, whereas it wasn't for me. And I think that's genuinely really important. I would like to say my son is only 8 and my daughter is only 5, so I would really hope that change comes before they are old enough to buy art. But yes, I think definitely we need to continue that upward trajectory. We do need more research into women artists, as much as I think the internet is a very, very powerful tool. I think we need to create also a scholarly canon, a scholarly art history and criticism for women that so far has been lacking, which big name collectors do still rely on to justify their purchases, which are still waved in their faces when they're in the private view at the private view of an exhibition. And museum rehangs are obviously key, but they need to be permanent, and that's something that's really important. So that's it really. On a personal note, I would just say, finally, build a supportive community or communities around you, whether they're women or not, whether they're female focused or not. I think, no artist exists alone, and it's so important for your work to live outside your studio, and that can really only happen when you have an artistic community or several. So I would say, yeah, that can give you so much power. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kitty. I'm just going to put us onto gallery view for questions. Everyone should be unmuted. So, do we have any questions? Right, I'm just going to check if I've unmuted everyone. Yeah. Any questions out there? I've got one if not.
Yeah, I was interested in you talking about the perceptions of female artists making work about bodies and motherhood, etc., etc. Do you think that's something that perhaps we should avoid, or in order to stop feeding into a stereotype, or do you think it's just we just keep? I think that potentially people make that kind of work because we're kind of forced to make that kind of work by the pressures of a capitalist society that's dominated by men. So naturally, these are things that affect us, and especially motherhood. I mean, that's not forced upon us by men, but that's forced upon us by nature. But yeah, I think because of the way the world works, that's the sort of thing that we create. So do you think? I don't know whether you're you think we should avoid potentially falling into that pitfall or not.
I think I sort of have two responses to that, which is, one is, if that's the work that you feel you became an artist to make, then I think, yes, continue with making that work, because there's still room for that work, absolutely 100%. I think I do agree with you that I think there has definitely been this women have felt pushed into this category and into making this work for a long time. partly because I think they've kind of felt that's how they can be seen. And so I think the answer is twofold. I think I wouldn't necessarily, if that's the work that you really want to make, then keep making it, because I do believe, like, in my dream art world, there would obviously be space for that work, that kind of work. But if you've always wanted to create something different, then I think don't let yourself be hindered by those kind of, like you say, capitalist sort of male constructs that have existed around, this, creating this kind of niche for women.
That's great. Thank you.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Hello?
Oh, hello?
Hi, where am I? You can hear me all right though, right? Yeah, because I can
Just
see
speak
you.
up a bit because you're a bit quiet.
Wow, that's a first.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you, Kitty. As always, amazing.
Thank
Um,
you.
I just kind of want to bring up this, what you were talking about before is that the white male default, right? And the
Mhm.
white male default for what we consider art history. And now as we're moving kind of women into the fold, and this idea of not tokenizing women within the art world, which
Mhm.
happened a lot with the feminist art movement in the 60s and 70s. All of a sudden, everybody got thrown in the feminist art corner if they were a
Yes.
woman making art at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
And now I feel that that's also starting that it's been happening with artists of color as well. And
I found
the
that really
market is,
strongly in the last
yeah, the market
maybe
is
year
doing
or
that.
two.
But I also find it's problematic with so many, I guess, so many talks, and including this one, and and just in general within the fine art world is how everybody's pretty much white, or everybody's really segregated within the communities that they're in. And when we say we want to bring up women artists, I always feel like that conversation also happens to have this unspoken default white women artists in that label. Otherwise they become art in the artists of color section, if you know what I'm saying. So the tokenization becomes split. We don't have women artists. We have women artists that are default white, and then we have women artists of color. And I'm wondering how we can move forward to help erase those lines and those boundaries as well, because essentially all of these groups together are essentially trying to smash the patriarchy, right?
Yeah.
And trying to smash the white hetero cis, capitalist structure that's gone on. So imagine
I
if you could speak to that, basically.
I actually totally agree with you, and this is something that I've also been thinking about a lot. And I think I've struggled with, I kind of feel that sometimes, and again, that there's this kind of white male capitalist narrative where everything that could possibly be seen as some kind of pressure group, so whether it's women, whether it's artists of color, whether it's like I say, disabled artists or gay artists, they all get kind of lumped together in some kind of non-white male mainstream. And I've always felt that it's important to give space to women artists, to artists of color, to disabled artists, to gay artists, etc., etc., as it goes, to trans artists as it goes along. But then, like you say, the issue with that is you're so busy giving space that you're right, you don't acknowledge the intersectionality which is there. And that's another, I mean, that you could have a whole talk on that just on its own. And that is a really, really difficult point, and it's a point that I think at some point, just like, the feminism in the 1970s was white women, and they then had to have this reckoning, and they're still having this reckoning. I kind of feel that we will also need to establish a narrative for ourselves as women, and for, as artists of color, as, gay artists, whatever it might be, or whatever many intersections it might be, and artists covering all those intersections, a narrative that is not necessarily just, oh, there's all these people who aren't white men, but a narrative where we are just part of the structure, and it's not these separate separate groups, as it were, and that's a massive challenge. And I don't, to be honest, I really don't know the answer other than say yes, I completely agree with you, and I see that problem existing, and I think about it a lot. And yeah, I honestly don't know, because at the same time, what I don't want, artists of color to feel is that, oh, there's all these white women now taking over our narrative. So there's also that point, which I think is a challenge. So yeah, I mean, any thoughts on that? Very welcome, because it is something that I struggle with too.
Yeah, I mean, my initial thought on that is that we personally, like, each one of us has to do the hard work that's necessary within our own privilege to, as we go through these spaces. And I oftentimes feel like that's never been brought to the fore a lot in these conversations. I feel like there's the, okay, I mean, I know that within your talk, your effort was to, this is the problem and this is how we're trying to solve it, which is quite different, I think, than a lot of talks where this is the problem and white men suck and they made everything shit and now we just have to deal with it and try to get into a museum, right? Whereas a lot of it, I mean, right? But I feel like a lot of it we have to kind of have that reckoning as well as privileged artists and the privileged few that some of us, were able to go into these post-grad institutions that were 98% white, right? And or have this community that is so elitist in the way that it is so based on the free time that is given to you by money and these disparities and the intersectionality of class and how that I don't think the conversation can be separate anymore, or it should not be separate anymore. So I just kind of want to bring that in.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the thing that like I say, I think I just struggle, like, I agree it should never be separate, but I think I struggle with, at the moment, combining it in a way that doesn't diminish any of the participants. And I think that's something that we need to be very aware of when we're doing it, because and also just assuming that everyone then has got the same, like you say, everyone just wants to get in a museum and say it's all white men's fault. Actually, no, people have very, very different narratives within what they do, and yeah, that's important as well. And accepting also that the experience of, say, a black male artist will be different from the experience of a black female artist who is also gay, and actually really respecting and looking at those intersections and looking at the challenges that those people face as well. I think that's important, that it's not just seen as, okay, now we're talking about women artists, now we're talking about artists of color. No, there are all these different junctures as well that we need to explore, that have this added level of complexity that we need to consider.
Yeah, definitely not an easy answer, for sure. I
No.
mean, there are no answers to it. It's just about what kind of space we're creating moving forward. I think that we have to be conscious of, for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from anyone else? Okay. Kitty, I just wanted to ask a little bit about, just for if no one else has got any more, just a bit more about, if you talk a little bit more about subject matter and what you do, and if you've got, like, favourite projects from that, or if, I don't know, if you've got things coming up. Or...
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got one of our favourite ever projects is going at the moment, which is, so we're essentially an online art platform. We represent 13 artists. But we also, obviously are connected to many, many others, and we basically, our sort of aim really is to make the art world more democratic and more transparent. We have all our prices on our website. We don't subscribe to this kind of slightly scary, hands-off mentality that so many other art institutions have. And we're just trying to essentially encourage more people to buy art. People just buying art for their home rather than, constantly needing this kind of massive collector with this, storage unit or whatever. And because we just believe that the more people who buy art, the people who buy art like they currently buy a sofa or buy a TV or whatever, like, I'm sorry, this is really basic, but it's true. If people like that bought art on the regular and really kind of felt that you know, that they were comfortable doing that and happy doing that, then actually more artists would be successful, and more artists would actually be able to make a living from making art. And that's really what we're about, and that's what we believe, and that's what we're trying to do with our platform. And then projects, well, we have at the moment this project that's going really well. We've never had we have, you know, sales, but it's just the two of us. We're a small business, and we've finally got something that has been absolutely flying, which is our lockdown commissions. And it's so for £150, people can commission an artist, and we've chosen eight of our artists to make a work for them under lockdown or socially distanced conditions. And so, yeah, and that has been absolutely flying, it's been fantastic. Like, we wake up every morning and we see we see all these like new orders. We're like, oh my God, I don't quite know what to do. But it's been great because it's really, people are just really responding. They love the fact that it's kind of brightening up their lockdown experience. They're excited to see what the artists are making. It's financial support for the artists at this time, which is obviously really important. It's also a creative outlet for them. So all in all, that's what I'm genuinely very excited about that at the moment. It's a wonderful thing to have been a part of, really.
Cool. Brilliant. I keep thinking I've muted myself. No, thank you so much. Any last questions from anyone else? No, great. Okay, we do this every time, so everyone can unmute themselves and just give Kitty a massive round of applause.
Oh, thank you.